Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On the 5th of November in the year 1505, Dom Lorenzo de Almeida arrived on the southern port city of Gaul in what's today Sri Lanka. From a traditional feudal society into a modern nation state. This transition began on the 5th of November 1505 with the arrival of the Portuguese Empire in the Indian Ocean. A few years before him, Vasco da Gama arrived in southern Indian city of Calicut, who famously said to have come looking for Christians and spices. What is the significance of this time? How did that come about? And what kind of impact did that time period have in our modern Sri Lankan psyche, in our modern culture, in our language, in our genetics? I believe there are significant learnings that we can take from this particular time. Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean was eventually supplanted by the Dutch and later by the British. Sri Lanka, the modern nation state Sri Lanka, which got the name on as recent as 1972. Before that it was called Ceylon. Again, this is the British English pronunciation of the Portuguese word Ceylon. So in this episode we're going to observe, not analyze or criticize or label in any sort of way, but simply observe. So this is my attempt to understand why they were in our part of the world, and then understand what they left behind, and then understand what sort of interaction, what sort of exchange that happened while they were on the island. And finally, I want to understand, looking at modern day Portugal and modern day Sri Lanka, what are they doing, and what are some of the things that we can learn from the Portuguese. This episode is not going to be like a historical analysis and what happened when, that kind of thing. This is going to be a broad overview and reference to that particular century or 2 centuries, and looking at cultural heritage of the Portuguese time that lasts until today, and my personal experience of growing up in Sri Lanka until I was 15 years of age, being immersed in this culture on a day-to-day basis, and what was that like, and having lived couple of decades away from Sri Lanka, and now I'm in a place where I can actually look back and say, hey, listen, what brought them to my homeland? What was the backdrop? What was the concrescence of factors that led to the arrival of the Portuguese Empire to Indian Ocean and then beyond, of course? There is a neighborhood in Colombo called the Slave Island, and this island is surrounded by an actual lake called Beira Lake, and Slave Island is known by another name, Companhia Vidya, meaning Companhia Street, Company Street. All of these are relics left behind by the Portuguese. And this area was called Slave Island because of reasons that should be fairly obvious. African slave labor was brought in since they built port cities in Gaul, in Colombo, and later in Jaffna, up north. From Mozambique, from Swahili coast in East Africa, and possibly other parts of African Portuguese territories such as Angola could be. But most of the African Sri Lankans retrace their ancestry back to Mozambique. Because I believe as a nation, we never got over this impact of colonization. And when it is talked about, it's usually in a very negative context with emotive language and rather unconstructive dialogues, right? When the negative context is already set, the narrative is already set, from that, we never go outside of that. We never had the chance to properly process that trauma and move on from that experience, you see. And that's why I think it's important to talk about the Ceylon Portuguese era here on Island Empire, because it's an important period in our history that I believe, that we can process in a more positive way and learn at least 3 key takeaways, which I'm going to lay down throughout the episode. First of all, understand why did the Portuguese arrive in Sri Lanka and Indian Ocean? What were the circumstances that drove them there? And what can we learn from that as Sri Lankans? Number 2, what did they leave behind? The impact on Sri Lankan culture, language, spirituality, and genetics, of course. What can we learn from that? What the Portuguese are doing now, today. And I believe there are some interesting learnings that we can take away from this period and what they're doing right now, what Portugal is doing right now as well. All right, so let's just recap. Why did the Portuguese arrive? What did they leave behind? What are they doing now? And what can we learn from each of these 3 key questions? What happened 500 years ago in Europe? The Italian city-states, who started becoming very prosperous, who built a maritime trading culture. A new upper class started emerging, the merchant class. The Merchant of Venice, and all these stories come from that particular era in history too, right? And you can imagine the atmosphere in the Mediterranean in those days. There are a lot of new things being discovered, coming into contact with the Muslim empires in the east, and Silk Road that came through China, India, Persia, Arabia, and all the way into the Mediterranean. A lot of new things, new ideas being exchanged between the East and the West. And one of the most significant things that happened around this time was that the Muslim and Jewish scholars in places like Salamanca University in Spain, Madrid, and other places, and also in Portugal, started translating Greek science, Greek and Roman literature from 1,000 years ago back then. This sparked a revolutionary movement called the Renaissance, or the Rebirth. Renaissance essentially was a rediscovery of an ancient, a bygone golden era, namely the Greek and the Roman, the Greco-Roman period in Europe. The Italian city-states and prominent families like the Medici family of Florence started funding artists like Leonardo da Vinci, for example, and navigators like Cristobal Columbus, for example. And there was this craze in Europe to explore the rest of the world and get into trade and emulate what the Italian city-states did. And Portugal was one of the pioneers of this particular movement. Skilled navigators, hardy sailors, left from Porto, from Lisbon, circumnavigated Africa, founded settlements all across, all along the western coast of Africa, navigated around the treacherous Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, founded Natal in KwaZulu, Mozambique, and then Calicut, India, Galle, Sri Lanka. So this is what happened. This is what drove them to the east, to take control of the Spice Trade that was then dominated by the Muslims. Indian Muslims from the Malabar coast in West India, they would be the middleman between the growers of spice in places like Kerala and other interior places in India and Sri Lanka. Cinnamon was much more valuable than gold at a particular time. And Europe was hungry for spice. So the Portuguese had one singular objective: to dominate the spice trade and seize it from the Muslims. And they succeeded. And they started founding an empire that stretched from Lisbon to Japan. Sri Lanka is in the middle of this journey, of this massive trade empire between the east and the western trade routes and trade winds. Sri Lanka was an ideal place to trade, and still is. Dom Lourenço de Almeida, the son of Francisco de Almeida, actually arrived on the island by accident. He caught a rogue trade wind and ended up on the south coast of Sri Lanka. So that's how he arrived. But this event sparked a 500-year-old movement of colonization, first by the Portuguese and then to be replaced by the Dutch and then the British, of course. Now, Renaissance is what drove the Portuguese into the Indian Ocean. Let's remember that. So the Europeans looked back to a previous golden age, Greco-Roman period. This is an important point. Now, the Greek science, the big names we know from back in the day, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, Pythagoras, Greek science, which was translated into Arabic by Muslim scholars and scientists, were now being translated back into Latin, Italian, German, French, English, Portuguese, and Spanish. This ended what's known as the European Dark Ages, or the feudal era. Right? This brought about modern commerce. This brought about empire. This brought about the finding of North America. Looking back into a previous golden era and celebrating science and scientific thinking can spark such powerful, impactful movements like the Renaissance, which brought 3 empires to the island nation we now call Sri Lanka. This is an important point. Moving on to the second key takeaway from the Ceylon Portuguese era, for me personally, is looking at the impact of the Portuguese time, compared that with what followed, namely the Dutch, which we will talk about in another episode, and then followed by the British. The impact of the Portuguese time is the strongest, and it's the most visible and audible in Sri Lankan culture. Right? Music, cafrinha, which literally means black music. Kafir is what the Portuguese called Africans. Kafir meaning non-believers or infidels. I know this is a derogatory, or this can be a derogatory term to use the word kafir. But in Sri Lanka, Kafri Nation, Afro-Portuguese Sri Lankans, are a very proud community, and they've contributed so much to Sri Lankan culture, and I feel like that needs to be acknowledged. Baila music, which is a popular folk music in Sri Lanka, comes directly from Afro-Portuguese community. The Roman Catholic religion arrived on the island via the Portuguese. Now, Christianity arrived on the subcontinent way before the Portuguese. Now, if you've read the Bible, you know Thomas, who was a disciple of Jesus, his tomb is in southern India. And Arab and Persian Christians, particularly the Nestorian Christians, were trading with Sri Lanka 2,000 years ago in the city of Anuradhapura in the north. So Christianity has a long presence in our homelands before the Europeans brought it. Again, as I always say, Christianity arrived 2,000 years ago. The church arrived 500 years ago. The impact of Portuguese language on Sinhalese language is significant. I can give you a whole list of words that I thought was my language, Sinhalese, but they're actual borrowings from Portuguese. When I discovered this as a child, when I was about 9 or 10 years old, that a significant part of Sinhalese culture is actually a creolized Portuguese, or creolized Afro-Portuguese to be more specific. This was an eye-opener for me as a kid. This led me to explore Sinhalese folk music, which is baila, which is a Portuguese word to dance, or cafrinha, which is an older form of the more modern baila music form, again, which means black music. The infectious 6/8 rhythm with very buoyant lyrics. Baila is what you're gonna hear when you get on a tuk-tuk in Sri Lanka, or get on a bus. Baila is when usually dignified aunties start to dance. At that time of the dinner parties, right? What did the Portuguese leave behind? Music, language, religion, genes, and more than anything, I believe the Portuguese left a certain perspective. Look, it's easy in Sri Lanka to chill. It's a tropical island. It's white sandy beaches, coconut trees, tropical jungle, and ancient cities and beautiful scenery. It's incredible. It's an incredibly beautiful place and incredibly hospitable, friendly people. I love Sri Lanka. I love being Sri Lankan. But we forget sometimes that we came into contact and into conflict with the first of the modern commercial empires, which rose out of a powerful movement called the Renaissance, which was a recollecting, remembering of ancient science, ancient philosophy, mathematics, medicine, that was left behind by a previous golden age. I believe, compared to the Dutch and the British experience which followed, I feel like although there had been many wars between the Sinhalese and the Portuguese, now I come from Kandy, I know the places where some of the battles took place, and few of my ancestors of my extended family clan fought against the Portuguese, and some of them sided with the Portuguese. Some of my ancestral family clan members spoke Portuguese. My family history is tied to this time. So that's why I think it's important for me to understand what brought them here. What did they leave behind? All right? Music, culture, Roman Catholic religion, genetics. A good half of the Sri Lankan population has Portuguese surnames: Da Silva, Pereira, Fernando. And we drink with vidro, which we put on the mesa, which is a table, and we open janelas, the windows, and we wear sapatos and camisas, and all of these Portuguese borrowings from that time, and many other linguistic, cultural nuances which I don't have the time to go into. But if you're Sri Lankan and if you're watching this and if you understand the deep impact of the Portuguese era, of the Ceylon Portuguese era, please go ahead and comment and share what you know. And I would love to learn more from you as well. My particular angle has always been through music. So I'm a huge fan and a geek when it comes to the Afro-Portuguese music and Afro-Portuguese culture in Sri Lanka. So that's my particular take. And if you know any other, or if you have any personal experiences relating to this time, please share and go ahead and join the conversation. Renaissance, the powerful intellectual movement that gave primacy to scientific thinking and discovery. This is important. Going back into a previous golden age and understanding their wisdom and applying it directly to the modern society. That's important. Number two, what did they leave behind? The exchange between Portugal and the Sinhalese seemed to have been, well, at least complicated. I don't buy the common narrative which says it was all conflictual. The cultural interchange between the two parties seemed to be a lot more complex than what we're told in the modern, politically driven position. I think the truth is always more complex than what we're told. And that's why I ask myself now, what are they doing now? I found this the other day that Portugal in 2016 submitted a paper called Mar Portugal. The link in the description if you want to have a look yourself. Basically what I understood from Mar Portugal initiative is that the Portuguese are seeking to extend their maritime territory. Portugal is here and there's an island out in the Atlantic here. Portugal can legally extend their maritime territory between the two land masses, thereby increasing the overall land masses and more opportunities to, I suppose, extract resources. And hopefully they will do this in a sustainable way. But the point is this: Portugal still pioneering out-of-the-box ideas and projecting themselves into what they always have projected to, the ocean. Sri Lanka, we as an island, I believe we need to project ourselves to the ocean. For 2,000 years, since the fall of Anuradhapura, we've been going into the interior of the island, from Anuradhapura to Kandy, my hometown. I believe this needs to be reversed. What I'm talking about is a reversal of the mind in the Sinhalese psyche, that we need to project ourselves back into the ports. And here's the urgent part of this whole episode, and here's why I want to talk about this Ceylon Portuguese era and what I learned from them. There is a new empire, and it's coming from the east. It's already taken one of the key ports in East Sri Lankan coast, Hambantota port. And this empire is already funding our infrastructure from Hambantota in the east coast to Colombo in the west, basically colonizing. So I believe we need to apply the lessons from history, particularly from the Ceylon Portuguese era, and reach back perhaps to a previous golden age that we had on the island 2,500 years ago, and apply ourselves in a very physical, vigorous way to exit the slave island mindset and go into island empire state of mind.